welcome to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I'm your host, Beth Stallwood, and in today's session, we're going to be talking all about emotional intelligence with expert Gary Hosey. I think it's such an interesting topic to talk about, and we could obviously have spent 3 or 4 weeks talking about all the different elements that make up emotional intelligence. But in this session, we're going to focus on conversations around actually, what about those challenging interpersonal moments? How do we connect with other people? How do we develop our own understanding of what our feelings are and how they influence our thinking and our behaviours? I do hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I'm really excited to be joined by Gary Hosey today. And rather than me introduce Gary, can I hand over to you and can you tell our audience a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, and maybe tell us a bit about how you got there? What was your career story?
Thank you for having me on, Beth. I'm delighted to spend some time with you and your audience. And I'd be delighted to share a little bit about me and my journey. So I'm a 30-year training and development sort of, I guess you'd call me a veteran now, really, at 30 years. And 20 of those years, I've had the joy of working with emotional intelligence. I was an early adopter in about 2000 and then started to collect some professional qualifications in 2003. And that led me on it's been quite an interesting journey, to say the least. Where it all started with me, as I've said, is in training and development. And that led me in 2009 to start my own company. And that's what I'm running now. So I'm a founder owner of a small organization, and we facilitate development programs working with senior leaders, senior leadership teams, not just around emotional intelligence. We do some different things as well, like rich picture development. But a lot of it is around behavior, performance, how people are working together and getting the best out for themselves and for the people that work with and for them. And a lot of coaching assignments as well, which is really a total privilege. And that is starting to form the book that I'm working on at the minute, which is EQ Influence, Leadership Behavior that Brings Extraordinary Results. And so that's a little bit about what I'm up to now. I guess the short story of how I got here is, as I mentioned, I was an early adopter into emotional intelligence. But I think biggest part of my journey has been personally, truthfully. So I would say that from the outset, I was really emotionally dysfunctional. Part of that was upbringing and what I was exposed to in home life and school life, and that's my parents did an amazing job, but it was a different generational time, and I had lots to learn. Then roll in a darling beloved, my Lula Bell, my wife, and my 2 darlings, Rebecca and Johnny, and you won't need me to tell you anything more about learning an emotional journey when you've got all that in the mix. So hopefully that's enough for now.
Oh, lovely. And thank you so much for your introduction, for telling us a little bit about you and what you do, and for being so open about like how these things, we don't always start with all this in hand, do we? We have to learn some of them as we go and build. And I think this emotional intelligence subject is a really interesting one, and I think a lot of our listeners will be really interested in it. But before we go into, and I've got lots of questions for you, Gary. We're gonna dive in deep.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, because I think emotional intelligence gets bandied around a lot in business, can you tell us what it actually really means? Like, really define it for us.
Yeah, delighted to. And I think I probably spent the first 10 years working out how to say this, because there's a lot in it. It's psychologically established understanding, a model, neuroscience gets involved in it. So we know we've got an established understanding. I would describe it really as everyday behavior.
Yeah.
And the everyday behavior that makes us successful in what we want to do or achieve in life. So there's elements around our confidence and assuredness, our motivations, how we talk about those things and express ourselves, how we stand up for what's important and what's right, how we work interpersonally with others, and then how I navigate the world and make decisions, because we all know, or we're certainly discovering much more in the psychology of things, that our emotional functioning influences every element and area of our life, and working life is very
Mm.
much a part of that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for describing it in that simple. And I imagine to get to that simplicity takes a lot of work when we're dealing with things like psychology and neuroscience, and something that is actually quite complicated or complex, maybe a bit of both, to really understand. And I'm interested to know about, obviously, this world of work and where we are, and how things like emotional intelligence, or a lack of emotional intelligence, which I'm sure we can have lots of it or not so much of it, can really influence how we feel personally about our work, but also how the influence that has on other people when we're working.
Well, you've hit on an absolute diamond thought there, Beth. So EQ influences our everyday because it's very much about everyday strengths. And although there's a level of complexity to the model, because we're living those behaviors, when we measure them and reflect and interpret, a measure or a psychometric on it, like the EQI, we get a very clear picture of how that behavior is showing up. And we
Mm.
can get a 360 perspective of that as well. So it very much does influence the everyday, and obviously immediately your inference then of what about a lack of emotional intelligence? Well, that can really have some seismic impact. So again, starting simple, our emotions influence our feelings and our thoughts, which both influence our behavior, which is about the everyday and our
Hmm.
performance. So if we track that back to feelings and emotions, if we're not clear on what's going on for us, we're probably not very clear about the behavior that might be showing up. And that's where that impact can have that seismic element. I mean, as I mentioned, I've had the privilege of working with many leaders in a coaching context, and one managing director asked me to work with their direct report and said, the wake of interpersonal challenges behind this very driven, high achieving individual is costing our business, and emotional intelligence helps us to focus in on that, the impact, the ripples, and the influence that that can have. So hopefully that gives you a kind of starting example.
Yeah. And I think this is so interesting, isn't it? And something that I always come back to when we're thinking about behavior and kind of trying to work back, what does that come from? And obviously I'm a coach as well, so I spend a lot of time like working out where these things
Mm.
and where these things start. Is that one thing I think we all have to remember is that the science has proved it now, I believe, that humans feel before we think. So
Yeah,
there's that is driving a lot. We do the thinking as well, we do
yeah,
get there, but
yeah.
actually the feeling stuff happens first. Yeah, I do believe in many workplaces we're kind of expecting those feelings not to happen because we're at work, and therefore we need to just think about the thinking stuff and not the feeling stuff. But we're all human beings, so we will all have a level of emotional intelligence. Like, it's not it is something that we all have and we all need to play with.
Completely. And in fact, we're all developing it in life, whether we're aware of it or not. And going back to your earlier point around a lack of EQ, if we're not aware of it, then we're on the back foot half the time. But going back to that, the behavioral bit and you know, feeling before we think. If you look at the work of Dr. Bruce Perry, who's written a couple of amazing books, one called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and he's a clinical psychologist and a neurologist, and he shows an image of the brain. He calls it the hierarchy of the brain, and the limbic system, or our emotional functioning, is at the bottom of the brain at the top of the spinal cord. So you're right, that emotional center is where it all happens before it gets into that executive functioning end, of the cognitive end. So you're absolutely right. That feeling is the foundational bit. The thinking bit really is intertwined with it, but it's after. So if we
Mm.
get stuck emotionally, we are in that kind of limbic brain system, which sometimes we see those driven behaviors, and that's where that negative impact can have a real cost.
Yeah, and I can imagine that all of us, like I'm sitting here thinking about times when you get emotionally hijacked, right? And your
Mm.
behavior is not what you want it to be. Like, who even was I in that moment when I was being like a grumpy teenager, or being like just really annoying, or being really a part that you wouldn't want to be in a behavior that you might not even know about sometimes. But we can all, I think, recognize when we're in that state, but we might not be able to recognize it until afterwards because we're like, oh, what happened there? Why didn't I use my logic and my thinking? And I just went into kind of the zone of emotionally out there.
Yeah, and I would describe that as an after awareness. So when we look
Yeah.
at our self awareness, we've got in the moment awareness where we're tuned into, we're aware of what might be going on for us, going on for others, and what might be going on in the room or the conversation. But the after awareness is like you've described, where we've been hijacked, we've not been fully cognizant of what's been going on. It's had an impact, and we're looking back and going, "Oh my, I've done that again," or "God, who was that there?" Because almost don't recognize that person.
Yeah.
And I think what EQ does, and that's where the EQ influence bit comes in, it gives us really a before awareness, even before we're in the situation. So if we can build our self awareness up enough, then we are able, as we're navigating what life chucks at us, we're much more in the moment of what's going on. And that's well, for me, it's that, advanced common sense place, really.
Yeah. I love that idea. Advanced common sense.
a
I
new a
love
new
it.
coin to phrase.
Yeah, it's great. And before we kind of dive into some of the things and some of maybe the practical things we can think about, I often hear it said things like, oh, they're really emotionally intelligent, or they're not very emotionally intelligent. We tend to hear about categorizing people.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about whether we're fixed or whether we can change and develop when it comes to emotional intelligence?
Well, it's certainly a changeable element to our self awareness, and I would count emotional intelligence as one aspect of self awareness. Of course, there are many other elements, characteristics, what we inherit, personality, and all those things. And the more I read in the current science material and the current thinking with psychologists is, much more is adaptable in IQ, personality, and especially emotional intelligence than we ever recognized before. Certainly because emotional intelligence is everyday behavior, we can shape that over time. Some areas are easier than others. And of course, as I intimated in my introduction, being emotionally dysfunctional means that we can learn a huge amount. I mean, I've had a real transformational journey with this in my own life, not only in a work context, but in my home and social life as well. And so when you present people with the image and the understanding around emotional intelligence, there can be a lot of light bulb moments of, oh, I kind of knew that, but I didn't know what it was called. And now I do. I can work much better with it.
Mm, yeah. So what we're saying is this is not a fixed trait. It's something that we can change, that we can work
Yes.
through it, we can transform through it. But I imagine we have to want to.
Oh, I think like anything like that, there's got to be that want to there, definitely.
Yeah. So love it. So we're talking about kind of everyday behavior. We're talking about the influence of our feelings and our thoughts on our behavior. Could you give us some of the different traits that we might see that we would kind of then categorize under the emotional intelligence banner?
So, when we look at a model or a concept around emotional intelligence, there are a few different variations out there. The one that I use in the work that we do is called the EQI 2.0. It's a scientifically validated model. and it's probably the most widely used measure of emotional intelligence in the world. Published by a Canadian organisation, a global leader in psychometrics. And it covers 5 different key composites, one around self-perception, how I know me, how I like me, how I'm able to leverage my strengths and understand how to manage and work with those areas that I'm less practiced at or might be weaker in. And then there's self-expression, about how do I share and express what's going on for me with clarity and meaning. So when leaders talk about winning hearts and minds, winning a mind is not hard, but winning a heart takes some emotional expression. So it really brings something in. And then you've got the interpersonal elements. I mean, we hear a lot around emotional intelligence and empathy, but there's also social responsibility in there as well.
Mm.
And then you've got using emotions in decision making. So, how I employ it with problem solving. So, how I factor in the people elements of what's going on for either me or others. How I keep that reality in check, and how I control impulses. And then the final area is called stress management, but it's really about how we navigate everyday life. Um, flexibility, how we cope with stress tolerance, and then our optimism and positivity around the hope for the future. So hopefully that gives you enough of a snapshot on the elements.
Yeah. And now I'm like, we don't have time to dive into all of them, but I really,
No.
really want to, because they're so interesting. And I'm thinking here about like that self-perception thing about, do I know me? Do I like me?
Mm,
And that's a deep one, right? That is like a, what do I
mm,
think of myself? What do I deeply feel about myself and my, my skills and what I do, as is the self-expression one. And it's so interesting when you say the interpersonal factor, because you said about empathy, and empathy is so often talked about in terms of emotional intelligence, and something that people either are good at or struggle with, having
yeah.
that empathy. But it's also really interesting to hear about the next one, which is around actually how do we make decisions, and what do we do, and what do we consider when we're making those decisions, and that ability to think about stress management, and how do we navigate everyday life with all of its complexities.
Yeah.
And when I think about it from a WorkJoy perspective, one of the things I talk about with WorkJoy is the fact that if you're able to get WorkJoy, you become more hopeful, because you're
Mm,
able to see that there are good things happening, that you're able to have control over some of those areas. So it's really interesting to look at all of these different factors, from kind of the in yourself things to the interpersonal things to actually the expression of it, and using it almost as a tool for your business as well as a tool for yourself.
I think what you've captured there, Beth, is absolute gold. Real life wisdom about how you use something like emotional intelligence in that everyday. And for me, understanding your work around WorkJoy has been just a lovely reawakening of actually the deep stuff in life, the really meaningful stuff, the stuff that we're really valuable. If we can get more of that into our everyday, especially in a work context, I mean, firstly, who doesn't want that? But that makes just for such a richer life experience. And I'm just so for that, marrying those two together, definitely.
Yeah, and I've got a quite specific question for you, because I
Okay.
think when I think about the people who come to me and they say, Beth, I'm getting some work gloom now,
Yeah.
or there's a situation that is causing me to not feel the joy at work, or to actually actively opposite joy, the work gloom side of things.
Yeah.
I would say, and I'm picking a number out of my brain because I'm not a numbers person, I'm going to say at least 60% of those, when they
Okay.
come, are something in that interpersonal category
Right.
when we're thinking about work. It's a, challenge with a boss. It could be a difficult teammate, or I always say it's not that they're difficult, it's that we interpret their behavior as difficult, because
Mm,
everybody's difficult in some way, right?
mm,
It's a challenging relationship with a client. It's a, I don't know how to influence this particular person, or I can't get the board on board with my plans. That interpersonal category,
mm.
I think, is a source of great work joy, but I'm not sure we'd notice it as much as we would the source of great work gloom? And I'm going to get really specific now. And I don't know if you're going to be able to answer it, but I'm going to give it a go. Let's see.
Give it a whirl.
If we've got somebody who is right now, they might be listening, feeling challenged by a person on the interpersonal factor,
Yeah.
what would be some of your thinking or some of your advice about how to go about working with that as a challenge? Have you got anything that, I know this is so generalist and also very specific, but is
Yeah.
there any kind of process that you would recommend people could start with to maybe think about how do I address an interpersonal issue?
Love it. And thank you for putting me on the spot.
It's really on the spot. I
Yeah,
appreciate
it's
that.
great. It's where the edge of life is. It's where it all happens. I think, and it might be a bit, a bit different to what you thought I might say, Beth, but I would actually start an individual like that on what's going on for them first before
Yeah.
they look at the other bit. And the reason that I say that is when we're feeling something stronger than kind of everyday feelings. So ways I would describe that is we feel triggered, or we feel a bit spiked, or a bit prickly, or, we've just got that stronger sense of something that's going on. I think it's really important to understand, what's actually going on for me. What is this feeling or emotion indicating? What is it saying to me? What's the message? Because sometimes when we're being triggered like that, it actually might not be the situation. It actually might be something that's not dealt with in your own individual life. And so the emotional response is actually more about me than it is about potentially the relationship. And if we know that, then we know that where we can focus that. So that would be my kind of first angle.
I think that's so interesting, isn't it? And we're so often in the jump into there's a problem over there, I need to deal with that problem, versus
Yeah,
hang on a minute, why is this for me something that I find difficult or triggering or a bit spicy or a bit, I don't know how to deal with this? Because sometimes, and I know I've been here, sometimes it's because I'm tired. Sometimes it's because that type of personality I've had a challenge with before and I find it really difficult. Sometimes it's because I'm really super invested
yeah,
in my way of thinking and the other person isn't yet. Like
yeah.
but I feel too connected to what I want to be able to understand what they need and want. So there are so many different reasons, aren't there, that for us internally as an individual might be driving our reaction to someone else's behavior.
Completely. And it's important to understand that. And I'm going to do a little shout out to our dear friend Alison Jones and Practical Inspiration Publicate. You know what I mean. Can't get
Practical
it out.
Inspiration Publishing.
Thank
That's the
you.
one.
That's the one. And Alison's latest book on exploratory writing. So for these kind of situations, an exploring writing session of 5 or 6 minutes on what's going on for me. And the way that I do this is I get a piece of A4, just literally a rough bit of paper. I write at the top my prompt or my question, I'm having difficulty in this relationship with, and put that at the top. And then I draw a line down the middle, and on the right-hand side of the page, I write at the top, I feel. And on the left-hand side, I write, I think. And I just spend a few minutes writing down, what do I think about that? And if I write a think down, then I take a moment to write down, what do I feel about what I think?
Mm.
And if I put a feeling bit down, then I take a moment to write down, what do I think about what I feel? Because as you were sharing earlier, Beth, we experience that feeling bit first, but it's often not the data that we spend time with.
Yeah.
So putting it down on a piece of paper like that helps us look at both elements of that data, because we want the thinking, but we also want the feeling bit. And that helps us make sense of that.
And so often, lots of people I know, including myself sometimes actually, the feeling bit is the harder bit to define.
Yes.
And I don't know if it's helpful to anyone else. And I've done this because it's like we often categorize emotions in quite big emotions
Yeah.
versus the real detail of them. If anyone's out there and wants to do this, go and Google the wheel of emotions, I think it's called, or an emotional
Yeah.
wheel that has
Plutarch's
like
wheel.
90 different emotions or something in it. There's loads of them.
That's the one,
To,
yeah.
what's it called?
Plutarch's wheel.
That's it. I knew you didn't have the answer to that one, Gary. Go and Google it and download it and have it somewhere near you, like keep it in your folder or something. Because actually, if we do want to kind of develop our emotional intelligence, I think we need to develop our emotional language and our ability to talk about these things. So rather than saying, I feel, broad spectrum angry about this, you might say, I actually feel frustrated about the specificness. Or you might say, I feel really worried about something, but it might be, more, we'll be able to find the more detailed word that really describes what you're feeling better. And because we're not taught this at school or anything like that, the language around emotions, I think there's some work to do around developing that language so that when we do stuff like I need to think about what I feel, we can actually write down what we feel.
Yes, I think you're absolutely on the money with that one. Although I would like to add a flavour of thought into what
Oh,
you've described there, Beth, if
add
that's okay.
away.
Yeah. So you mentioned what I call the F word, frustration.
Yeah.
So I actually describe that as the beigest, most meaningless emotional descriptor in all the world. And there,
It is, isn't it?
yeah, and the reason I say that is because it's the one that we all use as that go-to when we're not feeling quite on par. It's a frustration of one sort or another. But I think you're absolutely right that if you can get underneath the skin of that and say, well, what is my frustration? Is it irritation? Is it that I'm feeling anxious about something? Am I hesitant or uneasy? What are the other words that we'd use to describe that frustration? And that's where that real clarity comes through. And you're absolutely right. When we practice that kind of reflection, we can then use that in our emotional expressions. So our clarity of communication becomes not only much clearer, but also hugely more impactful in connecting with people on a human level.
Yeah. So I interrupted you with my kind of like, we need to be able to have better language feeling. So do some writing, understand what it is that we're actually dealing with here for ourselves first.
Yes.
And as you know from WorkJoy, I'm a huge believer in taking personal responsibility for our whole working lives. And this is one of those things, responsibility for the relationships and the interpersonal stuff that we have to do. So when we've done the thinking about ourselves, what might be your next suggestion?
Going to go off the wall again.
Okay, do it.
So I came across a quote by, I think it's Abraham Lincoln or one of the great American presidents, and it's this: I don't like that person over there. I need to get to know them better.
Yeah.
And when I first read that quote, it completely arrested me in my thinking at that time, because I was like, that is just not what I would do. I have if I've got a block with somebody or I'm not getting on, I don't really want to get to know them better. But that's really where it's at. If we talk about trust and developing that high trust relationship, we do have to get to know each other better. And a little tip that works for people, and it works particularly well for leaders, is when you want to get into a bit more feeling conversation, like, how am I feeling? How are you feeling? I often encourage people to start in a more sort of binary way and say, look, how do you feel on a 1 to 10 scale about this? And if you're a 5, 6 and I'm a 7, 8, we can see that there's some difference there. And let's explore that. Or we can say, well, what does your 5, 6 feel like? How would you describe it? And it's just a way of getting into that conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so often, I think when it is a challenging, tricky, spicy, whatever it is, relationship issue going on, we forget that the other person will be feeling something too.
Yes.
And most people aren't trotting along going, do you know what? I'm all right with this other person. Actually, Beth's all right. And I'm sitting there going, like
Yeah,
the girl of frustration or, irritation or just feeling like I can't get anywhere. Most of the time, both parties are feeling that, but we're not talking about that feeling. We'll be
yeah,
going, but we really need to get this thing signed off. Or can you just make sure that we do this? Or why can't we do it this way? We're talking about the thinking
yeah.
stuff versus talking about the feeling. But if we address the feelings, we get to the thinking stuff better.
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes a leader in a conversation or a situation like that, because we're all leaders, really, aren't we? Um,
For sure.
yeah, it's about expressing that feeling because that then connects it emotionally. Oh, I didn't realize you were feeling quite that strongly about it. And it changes the dynamic of the conversation. But it also gives permission to go into that kind of deeper stuff that's going on inside that we can often sense is going on. But, having the courage to enter into that is a challenge for a lot of us.
Yeah, and we've got to be careful, haven't we, about entering into that conversation with any kind of blame.
Yes.
So I can't sit here and go, Gary, you're making me feel like this, because
Mm,
that is going to get us nowhere. It needs to be a more this situation that we're in together. I'm feeling a little bit like this. How are you feeling about it? Okay, do we want to keep feeling like that or do we want something to change? And most people are going to go, we want something to change. And then it's more, you could do your 1 to 10s and what does that feel like for you? And how do we get from A to B and what can we do about it? But rather than dealing with the issue, but the emotion still being there, we're dealing with the emotions to then enable us to deal with the issue.
brilliantly put. I really like the way you've described that, and it, in simple terms, that's as simple as or as complex as we need to make it into the everyday conversation. And to start with, that it feels quite tough to do that, but once you've had a couple of goes around the buoy, it becomes a lot easier in just starting to engage in that
Yeah. It's probably one of those things, like most things in life, that the more we do it, the better we get at it.
completely.
And we can't just expect to be brilliant at it if we've never done it before.
Well, as I said, I'm 20 odd years into this and I'm definitely still learning. That is for sure, Beth.
So we need to think about ourselves first. Think about what's triggering us.
Yeah,
Think about how we describe that in terms of using some emotional language that we might be actually extending our vocabularies for,
yeah.
and then be able to go into a conversation with another person that's really open and slightly vulnerable, because you're telling people how you feel. That's a vulnerable situation to be in.
Hmm.
To then be able to go, okay, how do we address whatever it is that's going on here in a really sensible, non, trying to think of the right word, non-aggressive, non-blamey kind of
Mm.
a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked what you described with it before. The other person has feelings like I have feelings, and that's what I would describe as that active empathy. That I can actually engage with that behaviour almost as a bit of a process. What do I think they're feeling and experiencing, and that way we're being, um, less subjective to just what's going on for us, but we're able to be a little bit more objective to the situation rather than just the emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're not getting stuck in the
Mm,
emotional quagmire. We're going, okay, this is the emotion. I'm okay. I'll be able to work through that. But actually, let's look at this problem from a shared perspective versus a I'm stuck in there
mm,
perspective.
absolutely.
So some great tips there. I'm going to go back to the first point you made, the kind of first factor where you were talking about kind of knowing yourself, understanding yourself, liking yourself factor.
Yeah.
And this is a really deep one. So I imagine we're not going to have too much time to go into this too deeply. But for me, that sounds like, when I compare it to what we're trying to do with WorkJoy, it's understanding for yourself what, and you can tell me more about this, what it is that works for you, what doesn't work for you, knowing and being okay with who you are, understanding what your strengths are, kind of all of that stuff. I'm going to put it in their kind of self-development bracket.
Yeah.
In your head, when I say kind of work joy, how does that relate to us being able to cultivate and create a bit more joy in our lives?
Takes deep breath.
It's like a really big question, and I'm going to make you do it in like 4 minutes. So,
Yeah, no pressure. So and I think it's an absolutely brilliant question. So, and it's one of those ones it's worth chewing over, probably more than one conversation. But I think one of the key elements around emotional intelligence is awareness of our strengths and how they show up, the areas that are good for us. But there's also an element of, when you do a psychometric or a measure, they nearly always have an overplay element where
Oh,
the
yeah.
strength plays out in a more costly way. We call it the cost of being high. So when you talk about self-perception, there are three subscales that are in there, three behaviors and competencies. Self-regard, which is about confidence and assuredness, and knowing me, and the liking me bit is in there as well. Then there's self-actualization, which is about purpose, motivation, doing great stuff, and learning, which is a little side comment. I find that leaders that are not learning, one of the challenges is they're basically, almost on a backward trajectory because
Yeah.
they're not growing in that sense. And then the third area is emotional self-awareness. And if you look at self-actualization, when we talk about WorkJoy, this is a key behavior and competency, because we are driven as humans to do great work, and we love the work that we do. And the more that we can do more of that, we're right into WorkJoy,
Yeah.
as you describe it. And of course, the more we're in that place, the more that work isn't really like work. It's just stuff I love to do. The overplay or the cost of being high with self-actualization is I can be wanting to be too perfect. I can be pushing myself to the next thing and not enjoying either the journey or the end result of what I've just finished. And that can also be transposed onto measuring others in the same way. So I expect the same of others. So when we think about the driven environments where we work with people, Beth, we probably see a lot of that kind of behavior.
Yeah. Like I'm sitting here going, self-actualization stuff is exactly what is in the WorkJoy book, and it's like what we're talking about here is like make sure you've got your values and your purpose, and that you continue to learn, and that you do all this wonderful stuff. But so often the challenges come when we're trying to be perfect, we're trying to push ourselves, and we're expecting other people to be at that same level of perfection. But actually perfection is totally unattainable 100% of the time, because nobody in the world is good at everything.
No. And I think it also leans into, the be perfect elements of our human behavior that we're often so wrapped up in through our upbringing, our schooling, doing the very best. Why haven't we got an A? Getting that deal, achieving the next promotion, everything's about the next, the next, the next. And that cost of high then starts to have a big influence. So if you can build awareness of where that overplay starts to come in, and rather than it being an after awareness, get it as a before awareness, slow some of that stuff down a little bit. Suddenly we're more cognizant and aware in the moment, and we're able to enjoy that journey, even, dare I say, some of the more uncomfortable stuff, because we're just able to navigate it in a more healthy way. I'm often, inviting leaders to make friends with disruption and discomfort, because I mean, we know it's a big part of life anyway, but it seems quite heightened at the minute, and so
Yeah.
I think that awareness is really crucial.
Oh, for sure. Having that before it becomes an issue is obviously the ideal, isn't it? That advanced understanding, or
Yeah,
even just being able to recognize it if you're heading in that direction, and kind of go, am I expecting something of other people that is actually impossible when it comes to
yeah,
things like perfection? And I get that people want it, but it's actually the businesses of the future will be about disruption, and it will be about being able to work through discomfort. So I totally get it. Right, I'm gonna have to. We could dive into each of these subjects. I'm sure do like 5 or 6 hours on each of them. But I'm gonna
Yeah.
move us on to, if you're ready for it, some quick
Yes.
fire questions.
Yeah.
Right, first one for you, Gary. What is always guaranteed to bring you a little bit of work joy?
So in our office, we've got some plate glass windows that overlook onto a bit of greenery, which is fab. And when we moved in about 4 or 5 years ago, I asked because we're in a kind of shared office area and there's quite a few businesses here. I asked the management team here if I could put up a bird feeder on the balcony that overlooks our window. And I put the bird feeder up, and it took the birds 6 weeks to find it because they didn't know it was there, and it's there now. And I just get these moments of joy in the day when I see birds feeding, and especially in about April time when the kind of parents bring the kids along for a feed, and you see the pristine little blue tits and robins and that, and you see the haggard and worn out adults who've been looking after them. So that's a little look inside my head.
I
That's
love
a
it.
joy for me.
It's like the reality of real life and parenting everywhere in all walks
Yes.
of life, but also that connection to like nature and something beyond things I can really feel coming out as a
Yeah.
bit of work joy for you. And I always say, if you're feeling a bit gloomy, go for a walk, and a walk
Super.
will almost always make you feel a little bit better.
I completely agree with that. Definitely.
Right, next one. What book are you currently reading?
Cool. That's an impossible question to answer, Beth, I'm afraid, because I'll have six. I've
I
got
usually have a
your
few on the
book.
go. Oh,
I've got
what's
your
that?
book. Yeah. So I'm working through that one because that's fairly fresh. I've got Alison's book, as I've mentioned. I'm also reading Beck Evans' Written with her partner Chris. Are three that I've got on the go at the minute.
Excellent.
Yeah.
You're the first person on the podcast to say you're reading my book, so I like that. You get extra points for
Eee!
that, Gary.
A moment of work joy.
Total work joy. What is one bit of advice that you've had in your life that you always find yourself coming back to?
Oh, I love that question. That is so good because this isn't my wisdom. This is shared wisdom that gets often passed from generation to generation.
Mm,
And this was shared with me when I was a bit younger than I am now, and it sits brilliantly. And I do share it a lot with people, and it goes like this: of all the sayings in all the world, the one to see you through is never trouble, trouble, till trouble troubles you. We're so often worried about this, and what if this happens, and I've got that to worry about tomorrow. When those troubles come, yes, we've got to respond to them, but it's not worth wasting our time on them. And it's certainly a joy stealer for me.
isn't it just? And I feel like we're programmed, aren't we, to worry about stuff that might happen versus
Mhm.
deal with it when it comes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great bit of advice to think about. I think it's a tough one to be able to actually practice,
Oh,
but
yes.
yeah, control the controllables and all that, and actually just work on the stuff that you've got and know that you have the resources to deal with the difficult stuff when it comes and to reach out for help for it when you need it.
Yeah, and I think that's, in emotional intelligence terms, that's that self-regard, that assuredness that we are going to face those challenges, but I've got what I need to be me right now, even if I don't know the answers.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll find them. You'll find the way.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And then that's a bit of advice that is shared wisdom. Tell us one bit of practical advice for our listeners from you that's something that they could go and do today, tomorrow, something simple that you think might help them get a little bit more work joy.
I think building on what we were talking about before about knowing what's going on for us, I would describe it as practice noticing.
Mm.
At different points through the day, just stop for a moment and just check in, how am I feeling? What's going on for me? And that helps us tune into when things. I loved your word earlier, Beth. Actually, I'm going to steal that one and put it in my back pocket. And it's the spicy times,
Yeah.
which just it speaks volumes, doesn't it? But I think when we do the practice noticing, we also start to notice more of the joy stuff as well, and I think that is hugely important.
It's in fact the first thing I recommend anybody does when we're looking at getting small work joy is to spend a week tracking what it is that's brought you joy, because we're so often, because of negativity bias, focus on all the
Yeah,
stuff that doesn't bring us joy versus the stuff that does. And even just doing that for 1 week, and on Create Work Joy website there's a download that you can use, we've got it all there ready to go, to actually just track it. And some people have had like massive revelations going, actually it's not that bad, I'm just
yeah,
focusing on the wrong things.
fabulous.
Love it. And then finally, Gary, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Thank you for that invitation. I'm all over LinkedIn. I love that place. I love the learning and the sharing and the networking that goes on there. So you can either follow me or reach out and connect. I'd be delighted to connect. I'm on Insta as well. And you'll find it just with my name, Gary Hosey. I'm thankfully got one of those more unusual names that doesn't pop up quite so often. And then you can find me at garyhosey.com, and my company web address is eicompany.co.
Brilliant. And we will put all those links into the show notes so that you can click straight through and get in touch with Gary. Gary, thank you so much for coming on and being a great guest. There's so much brilliant stuff when it comes to emotional intelligence. And thanks for diving into my challenging, can you please tell us something in 3 minutes, something that would actually probably take you 3 years to learn, questions.
Oh, they're just ace questions. It has actually genuinely been a complete joy. Thank you for having me on. I've loved every minute.
You're very welcome, Gary. A huge thank you to Gary Hosey for joining me today on the WorkJoy Jam podcast. Such an interesting topic, and one that I think is talked about a lot in organisations around emotional intelligence, but one where the responsibility actually, as with most things, really relies on us as individuals to be able to consider, to think, to acknowledge that we are emotional beings, that we feel before we think, but that combination of what we think and feel will be driving our own behaviours and driving other people's behaviours. So how do we get to understand other people better? How do we get to connect with them? How do we bring some of this emotion stuff into workplaces that are so often driven by the thinking side of things, where emotions aren't always acknowledged or considered or acted upon? So some really interesting things there from Gary. Thank you so much. I'll be taking away lots of your advice and hoping to get that advanced understanding versus the in the moment understanding of what's really going on when we feel a little bit emotionally hijacked. Do go and listen to other episodes of the WorkJoy Jam. There's plenty there. Different people, different walks of life, different situations, different angles on a WorkJoy. Go and pick and mix some and see which ones you really like. We'd love it if you could subscribe, follow, and comment and rate the podcast. That really helps get it into the ears of people who would enjoy it even more. And we also have other things available through the WorkJoy family of stuff. There's the WorkJoy book, a toolkit for a better working life, available now at all good booksellers, especially the online ones. We have Club WorkJoy, a fantastic community of people all aiming to get more joy in their work, with lots of great conversations and content on Club WorkJoy. And we also have the WorkJoy Way coaching program that happens a couple of times a year. If you're interested, do get in touch. You can get in touch with me at hello@createworkjoy.com and go to createworkjoy.com to see all the information. Thanks so much. Have a great day.